In the mid-1990s, a teenage girl vanished in Utah, and for years the reason remained unanswered. What was found days later would raise questions that technology of the time could not resolve. Evidence existed, but it could not speak yet. Investigators preserved what they could, knowing that science sometimes moves slower than justice. The name Krystal Beslanowitch stayed in records, not headlines, while time passed, and answers did not come. What mattered most in those early days was not who was responsible, but what could be proven. This story follows the path from that first discovery to a conclusion reached much later, shaped by patience, procedure, and evidence that waited quietly for decades. If you value factual storytelling that explains how investigations actually work, subscribe to the channel for more responsibly presented reports. Krystal Beslanowitch was 17 years old when her body was discovered in Utah County in 1995. The location was outdoors, away from heavy traffic, and the surroundings suggested she had been left there rather than dying from natural causes. Law enforcement officers responded and secured the area to prevent contamination. Standard documentation began immediately, with photographs, measurements, and written observations recorded before anything was disturbed. Investigators noted visible injuries consistent with a violent death, which led authorities to treat the death as a criminal matter from the start. The scene was processed carefully, and items found nearby were collected as potential evidence. Among those items were materials that could carry biological traces, although the technology available at the time limited what could be extracted or interpreted. Every object was cataloged, labeled, and preserved according to procedure. Identification followed through personal records and confirmation by family members. Krystal had been reported missing earlier, and investigators worked to establish her last known whereabouts. Information was gathered from people who had seen her before she disappeared, along with any known activities documented in police reports. These steps were necessary to reconstruct the hours leading up to the discovery, even though gaps remained. The medical examination confirmed the cause of death involved blunt force injuries. This finding reinforced the direction of the investigation and shaped how evidence was evaluated. The results were shared with detectives, who coordinated closely with forensic staff to determine whether any physical material could be linked to a specific individual. At that time, DNA analysis required larger and cleaner samples than what was often recovered from outdoor scenes. Despite careful work, no immediate suspect emerged. The physical evidence did not produce a usable genetic profile, and witness information did not point clearly to a single person. Investigators continued reviewing reports, rechecking statements, and comparing details, but progress slowed as leads failed to develop. The limitations were not due to neglect, but to the state of forensic science and the information available. The evidence collected was not discarded. Instead, it was stored with the understanding that future advances might allow further testing. This decision would later prove critical, though that outcome was unknown at the time. For now, the priority was accuracy, preservation, and documentation, ensuring that nothing collected would be compromised. As weeks turned into months, the investigation remained open without resolution. Krystal Beslanowitch's name stayed in official files, and her death remained unresolved. What began in a remote area of Utah County entered a long period of uncertainty, defined by careful record-keeping and unanswered questions, waiting for a development that had not yet arrived. Following the confirmation of Krystal Beslanowitch's identity, investigators shifted their attention to reconstructing her movements before she disappeared. This work relied on documented reports, timelines provided by family members, and information gathered from people who had seen her in the days leading up to her death. The goal was to determine where she had been, who she may have encountered, and how she ended up in a remote area of Utah County. Law enforcement reviewed missing person records and compared them with the location where her body was found. Officers examined transportation routes, nearby towns, and areas she was known to visit. These steps were intended to narrow the window between her last confirmed sighting and the discovery of her body. Investigators understood that establishing this window was critical for identifying potential witnesses or suspects. Interviews were conducted with individuals connected to her daily life. Friends, acquaintances, and others who may have had contact with her were questioned using standard procedures. Each statement was documented and evaluated for consistency. Some accounts provided partial timelines, while others offered limited insight. None produced a clear direction that could be pursued immediately. Conflicting details and incomplete information complicated efforts to form a cohesive sequence of events. Investigators also reviewed reports related to prior contacts with law enforcement. These records were examined to determine whether any previous incidents or interactions could be relevant. While this review provided background context, it did not establish responsibility for her death. Authorities remained cautious about drawing conclusions without supporting evidence. Physical evidence collected from the discovery site was sent for forensic evaluation. At the time, DNA testing required samples of sufficient quantity and quality. Outdoor exposure often degraded biological material, and this was a known challenge in investigations involving open environments. Analysts attempted to extract usable information, but the results did not yield a profile that could be compared against existing databases. Without forensic confirmation, investigators relied heavily on traditional methods. Tips from the public were reviewed as they came in. Each lead was logged, assessed, and either followed or ruled out based on available facts. Some tips lacked corroboration, while others could not be verified. None resulted in an arrest or formal accusation. As weeks passed, attention turned to individuals who had prior violent histories or were known to frequent areas near where Krystal was found. Background checks were conducted, and some people were interviewed more than once. These steps were carried out within legal boundaries, ensuring that civil rights were respected. Despite these efforts, no evidence emerged that could support charges. Investigators also considered whether the death could be linked to other unresolved incidents. Comparisons were made with similar reports from surrounding jurisdictions. Patterns were reviewed, but no confirmed connection was established. The absence of distinctive markers made it difficult to link her death to other known offenses. Throughout this process, documentation remained a priority. Reports were updated, evidence logs were maintained, and findings were shared among agencies when appropriate. Supervisors reviewed progress and assessed whether additional resources could change the outcome. At that stage, available tools and information had been exhausted. The investigation did not end, but momentum slowed. Without new evidence or credible leads, active efforts were reduced. The focus shifted toward maintaining records and preserving collected materials. This approach reflected an understanding that future developments in forensic science might offer opportunities not available at the time. Krystal Beslanowicz's death remained unresolved, not due to lack of effort, but because the information needed to move forward was missing. Investigators continued to monitor the file, prepared to act if new details emerged. What remained was a carefully documented investigation, preserved evidence, and unanswered questions that could not yet be resolved within the limits of the era. As active investigative avenues narrowed, attention increasingly centered on the physical material recovered from the discovery site. Each item collected during the initial response had been logged, sealed, and stored according to established procedure. This evidence represented the most objective record of what had occurred, independent of memory or interpretation. Its value depended not only on what it contained, but on how carefully it had been handled. Investigators reviewed the inventory repeatedly. Clothing, personal belongings, and other materials found near Krystal Beslanowitch were examined for trace information. Outdoor exposure had already complicated the process. Weather, terrain, and time all worked against the preservation of biological material. Even so, forensic staff attempted to extract what they could using the methods available during the mid-1990s. At that point, DNA analysis required relatively large and intact samples. Many forms of trace material degraded quickly when left in open environments. Laboratory testing was conducted on items considered most likely to retain biological evidence. Results were documented, but none produced a genetic profile suitable for comparison. This did not mean the evidence was useless, only that current technology could not interpret it. The decision was made to retain all collected material rather than dispose of it. This choice reflected standard practice, but also a recognition of the rapid pace of scientific development. Evidence was packaged to prevent contamination and stored in controlled conditions. Chain of custody records were maintained to ensure integrity. Every transfer, review, or examination was logged in detail. Investigators also preserved written records alongside physical material. Scene photographs, sketches, laboratory reports, and interview summaries were filed together. These documents provided context that could later support renewed analysis. Without them, physical items alone would offer limited meaning. Preservation involved both matter and information. Over time, routine audits confirmed that the evidence remained accounted for. Supervisors reviewed storage conditions and verified documentation. Although the investigation no longer generated daily activity, responsibility for the material did not lapse. Maintaining readiness for future review became the priority. During these years, advances in forensic science were occurring elsewhere but not yet applied here. New techniques were discussed within law enforcement circles, though access and validation took time. The preserved evidence remained untouched, waiting for a point when re-examination might be justified. Until then, it stayed secured, unchanged, and carefully tracked. This period underscored the limits faced by investigators. Without a viable suspect or interpretable forensic results, progress depended on developments beyond immediate control. The preserved items represented potential rather than answers. Their significance lay in what they might reveal under different conditions. Krystal Beslanowitch's death remained unresolved, but the groundwork for future action had been quietly established. Evidence had not been lost or overlooked, it had been protected. That decision ensured that when technology eventually caught up, there would still be something to examine. As time passed without new evidence or reliable leads, investigative activity slowed. The initial surge of interviews, tip reviews, and forensic testing had reached its limits. Nothing available at that point allowed authorities to identify a responsible individual or move toward formal charges. What remained was a file filled with documentation and evidence that could not yet be interpreted. Law enforcement agencies reviewed the work already completed to ensure no steps had been missed. Supervisors examined reports, timelines, and forensic results. The conclusion remained the same. The information gathered had been handled correctly, but it did not support further action. This assessment was not an admission of failure, but a recognition of practical limits. Public attention faded as months turned into years. Without developments to report, media coverage declined. Krystal Beslanowitch's name stayed within official records rather than headlines. For investigators, this meant fewer incoming tips and reduced external pressure. The investigation remained open, but active pursuit was no longer possible using existing tools. Administrative decisions followed standard practice. The investigation was categorized as inactive, meaning no daily work continued, while still allowing for immediate response if new information emerged. Responsibility for the file was assigned rather than abandoned. Evidence storage, record maintenance, and periodic review became the focus. During this time, investigators occasionally revisited the material. Files were reviewed when staffing changed or when new personnel were trained. These reviews ensured familiarity with the facts and preserved institutional knowledge. No new conclusions resulted, but continuity was maintained. The lack of progress highlighted broader challenges common to unresolved violent deaths from that era. Forensic science had advanced significantly since earlier decades, but many techniques were still developing. DNA databases were limited, and extraction methods were less sensitive than they would later become. Investigators understood that certain answers might remain unreachable unless technology changed. Families affected by unresolved deaths often seek closure, but law enforcement operates within evidentiary boundaries. Without proof that meets legal standards, action cannot be taken. This reality shaped how the investigation was managed. Accuracy and restraint took priority over speculation or premature conclusions. Throughout these years, the preserved evidence remained central. Its existence meant the investigation was not truly closed. The materials collected in 1995 were still available, protected by documented custody and controlled conditions. Their potential value depended on future capabilities rather than present certainty. Krystal Beslanowitch's death remained unresolved, defined by unanswered questions rather than conclusions. The investigation entered a prolonged pause, marked by careful preservation rather than active pursuit. What endured was a record of diligence within the constraints of the time, and the understanding that resolution depended on developments not yet available. Years after the investigation slowed, changes in forensic science began reshaping how unresolved violent deaths could be examined. During the mid-1990s, DNA testing existed but required substantial biological material and offered limited comparison options. By the early 2000s, laboratories were developing methods capable of extracting usable genetic information from far smaller and more degraded samples. These developments altered expectations across law enforcement agencies. Advances focused on sensitivity and reliability. New extraction techniques allowed analysts to recover DNA from items previously considered unsuitable for testing. Improvements in amplification meant that partial samples could be examined without destroying all remaining material. These changes were accompanied by stricter laboratory protocols designed to reduce contamination and ensure reproducibility. Together, they expanded the range of evidence that could be analyzed. At the same time, DNA databases were growing. Earlier systems contained relatively few profiles, limiting their usefulness. Over time, mandatory collection policies and technological upgrades increased the size and reach of these databases. This growth improved the likelihood that an unknown profile, if obtained, could be compared against existing records. For investigators reviewing unresolved deaths, this represented a shift from uncertainty toward possibility. Law enforcement agencies monitored these developments closely. Training programs and professional briefings emphasized how emerging techniques could be applied to preserved evidence. Decisions about re-examination required careful consideration. Evidence had to be intact, properly documented, and suitable for newer methods. Not every stored item qualified, and testing carried costs and risks. Once a sample was consumed, it could not be replaced. Forensic scientists also emphasized validation. New techniques were not immediately accepted without review. Courts required proof that methods were scientifically sound and widely recognized. This process took time, but it ensured that results would withstand legal scrutiny. Investigators understood that reliable evidence mattered more than rapid testing. In Utah and elsewhere, agencies began identifying older investigations where preserved material might benefit from reanalysis. Selection was influenced by factors such as evidence condition, seriousness of the offense, and potential impact. Each decision involved collaboration between detectives, forensic specialists, and prosecutors. The goal was to determine whether renewed testing could produce information that had previously been inaccessible. This broader shift did not guarantee resolution. Many preserved items still failed to yield results, even with advanced methods. Environmental exposure, handling, and age continued to affect outcomes. Yet the probability of obtaining usable information had improved enough to justify careful reconsideration. For unresolved investigations like the one involving Krystal Beslanowitch, these scientific changes introduced a new phase of evaluation without altering past conclusions. The original work remained valid within its context. What changed was the toolkit available to examine what had already been collected. Evidence that once fell silent could now be approached differently. The emphasis remained on restraint and procedure. Testing would occur only when justified by evidence integrity and investigative value. Records from earlier years provided essential context, guiding decisions about which items might benefit from newer techniques. Without accurate documentation, even advanced science could not compensate. These developments marked a turning point in how long unresolved deaths were viewed. Time no longer worked only against investigators. In some circumstances, it allowed science to advance far enough to revisit preserved material with fresh capability. For those responsible for maintaining evidence, this reinforced the importance of decisions made years earlier. What had been stored carefully now carried renewed significance. The potential embedded within preserved items depended not on speculation, but on validated methods and cautious application. For investigators, the promise lay not in certainty, but in the possibility that technology had finally reached a point where previously unreachable information could be examined again. With advances in forensic science becoming more widely accepted, investigators reassessed whether preserved material from earlier years could now be examined using newer techniques. This reassessment did not begin with assumptions or expectations. It began with documentation. Every item collected in 1995 was reviewed against storage records to confirm condition, handling history, and suitability for further analysis. Only material that met strict criteria was considered. Forensic specialists evaluated which items had the highest likelihood of retaining usable biological information. Exposure to weather, time, and handling all affected viability. Analysts focused on objects that had been protected from excessive degradation and had clear provenance. These decisions were guided by laboratory standards rather than investigative pressure. Once items were identified, testing plans were developed carefully. Newer methods allowed for recovery of DNA from smaller samples, but they also required precise controls. Evidence consumption was a serious concern. Testing could permanently alter or destroy material, so approvals were obtained before proceeding. Prosecutors were consulted to ensure that any future results would meet evidentiary standards. Laboratory work followed validated protocols. Analysts documented each step from packaging inspection to sample preparation. Contamination prevention remained a priority. Workspaces were controlled and comparisons against staff elimination databases were conducted as part of routine safeguards. The goal was accuracy, not speed. Among the items selected for re-examination was a cigarette butt that had been recovered near the original discovery location. At the time it was collected, available testing methods could not produce usable information. Advances in extraction and amplification now allowed analysts to attempt recovery from trace material that had once been insufficient. The testing process involved isolating potential biological residue and attempting to amplify genetic markers. This work required multiple stages and verification steps. Analysts monitored results closely, knowing that partial or degraded profiles could still carry significance if interpreted correctly. Findings were reviewed internally before being reported. The outcome of this testing differed from earlier efforts. Usable genetic material was successfully recovered. This result did not immediately identify an individual, but it represented a change from previous conclusions. For the first time, preserved evidence had yielded information capable of further examination. Investigators treated this development cautiously. A recovered profile required confirmation and contextual review. Analysts assessed whether the genetic material could be attributed to handling unrelated to the event. Location, condition, and documentation were evaluated together. This ensured that conclusions were grounded in evidence rather than assumption. Additional laboratory checks were conducted to confirm consistency. Reproducibility mattered as much as recovery. Results were compared across tests to rule out error. Only after this process did forensic staff communicate findings to investigators. The investigative response remained measured. There was no immediate announcement or operational shift. Instead, detectives reviewed records to determine next steps within legal frameworks. Any action based on forensic findings required adherence to procedure, including verification and database protocols. This re-examination demonstrated the value of long-term evidence preservation. Decisions made years earlier allowed new technology to be applied without compromising integrity. The preserved cigarette butt, once considered uninformative, now carried potential investigative value. The development also underscored the difference between discovery and interpretation. Recovering genetic material did not establish responsibility. It created an opportunity for further comparison within approved systems. Investigators understood that this opportunity carried both promise and obligation. Careful documentation continued. Reports detailed methods used, results obtained, and limitations identified. These records ensured transparency and prepared the groundwork for any future legal review. What had changed was not the past, but the ability to examine it. The re-examination marked a transition from preservation to renewed analysis, guided by science rather than speculation. The evidence had remained silent for years. Now it had produced information, and with it, a path forward defined by procedure, caution, and verified methodology. Once a usable genetic profile had been confirmed through repeated laboratory review, investigators moved into a controlled and highly regulated process of comparison. The profile recovered from preserved evidence could not stand alone. It needed context, verification, and lawful evaluation through approved systems. Every step that followed was governed by procedure designed to prevent error and protect rights. The profile was submitted for comparison against available DNA databases. At that time, these systems contained records collected from individuals through prior convictions and legally authorized sampling. Database searches were not exploratory guesses. They operated under defined rules that limited how information could be accessed and interpreted. Investigators waited for results that could either exclude known individuals or indicate a possible association. When a match was identified, it did not immediately translate into certainty. A database hit represented a statistical correlation that required confirmation. Analysts reviewed the strength of the match, examining the number of genetic markers and the probability calculations associated with them. Independent verification was essential before any investigative decision could be made. The identified profile corresponded to a man who had prior involvement with the criminal justice system. His name entered investigative records only after laboratory staff confirmed the reliability of the match. At that point, detectives began reviewing his known history, movements, and connections during the mid-1990s. This review relied on documented records rather than recollection or inference. Investigators assessed whether the individual could be placed in Utah during the relevant period. Employment records, prior addresses, and known travel patterns were examined. This step was necessary to determine whether the genetic association aligned with documented opportunity. Without this alignment, the match would not support further action. Attention remained focused on evidence rather than narrative. The recovered DNA linked the individual to an item found near where Krystal Beslanowitch had been discovered. Investigators evaluated how that item could have come to be there. They reviewed scene documentation, collection notes, and environmental factors recorded years earlier. The aim was to ensure that the presence of the genetic material could not be explained by unrelated activity. Legal standards guided every decision. Investigators worked with prosecutors to determine what additional confirmation would be required before moving forward. This included evaluating whether a direct DNA sample could be lawfully obtained from the identified individual for comparison. Such steps required court authorization and adherence to constitutional protections. Once authorization was secured, confirmatory testing was conducted. A new sample was collected under controlled conditions and compared directly to the recovered profile. Analysts followed the same rigorous protocols used during earlier testing. Results were reviewed for consistency and accuracy. Only after this process did the genetic association reach evidentiary reliability. With confirmation complete, investigators prepared detailed reports outlining the forensic findings. These reports included methodology, statistical interpretation, and documented limitations. Transparency was critical. The evidence needed to withstand scrutiny not only from courts, but from independent experts. Identification did not conclude the investigation. It redirected it. Detectives reviewed additional records related to the individual, including prior statements, known contacts, and any documented interactions that could be relevant. This review did not rely on assumption, it relied on corroboration and verifiable information. Throughout this process, restraint remained central. Investigators understood that DNA evidence is powerful but not self-explanatory. It establishes association, not narrative. The responsibility lay in integrating scientific findings with documented facts while avoiding unsupported conclusions. For the first time since 1995, the investigation had a focal point grounded in physical evidence rather than absence. This shift did not alter past uncertainty, but it introduced clarity where none had existed. The identification was not treated as an ending, but as a transition into formal legal evaluation, guided by procedure, verification, and evidentiary standards. The preserved evidence had now produced information capable of supporting accountability. What followed would depend not on technology alone, but on how that information was examined within the legal system, with careful attention to proof, process, and documented fact. After confirmatory forensic testing established a reliable genetic association, investigators moved forward within the limits of law. The process leading to arrest followed structured steps rather than urgency. Detectives compiled reports detailing the evidence, laboratory methods, and verification results. These materials were reviewed by prosecutors to determine whether legal standards for arrest had been met. Authorities sought warrants supported by sworn documentation. The information presented emphasized facts rather than interpretation. It outlined how preserved evidence from 1995 had been re-examined using validated methods, and how results were independently confirmed. Judicial approval reflected a determination that probable cause existed based on the documented record. Once warrants were issued, law enforcement located the individual identified through DNA comparison. The arrest was conducted without public spectacle. Investigators focused on securing custody and preserving procedural integrity. At that point, responsibility shifted toward formal charging and court oversight. Prosecutors filed charges related to the death of Krystal Beslanowitch. The charging documents outlined allegations grounded in physical evidence and supporting records. The filings did not attempt to explain motive or reconstruct events beyond what could be proven. Their purpose was to present a legally sufficient basis for prosecution. Initial court proceedings followed standard practice. The accused was informed of the charges and legal rights. Bail considerations reflected the seriousness of the allegations and statutory guidelines. Throughout these steps, emphasis remained on process rather than outcome. Investigators continued working alongside prosecutors to prepare for trial. Evidence inventories were reviewed again to ensure completeness. Chain of custody documentation was rechecked. Forensic experts prepared to explain testing methods, limitations, and statistical conclusions. This preparation aimed to ensure clarity rather than persuasion. Defense counsel examined the evidence independently. Challenges focused on forensic methodology, sample integrity, and interpretation. This adversarial review formed part of the legal process designed to test reliability. Prosecutors responded by referencing laboratory standards and peer-reviewed practices. Public attention returned as charges became known. Media coverage reported the arrest and upcoming proceedings, often noting the passage of time since 1995. For investigators, the focus remained on documentation and courtroom readiness. Public reaction did not alter evidentiary requirements. The filing of charges marked a transition from investigation to adjudication. Decisions were no longer solely in the hands of law enforcement. Courts assumed oversight, ensuring that evidence would be evaluated according to established rules. The role of investigators shifted towards supporting the legal process through testimony and record presentation. Throughout this period, restraint remained essential. Authorities avoided statements beyond what court records allowed. The emphasis stayed on factual presentation rather than narrative framing. This approach reflected an understanding that accountability depends on proof tested openly. The arrest did not resolve unanswered questions on its own. It initiated a formal examination of evidence before a jury. What followed would determine how the preserved material, recovered DNA, and investigative record would be weighed under legal scrutiny, with outcomes decided not by investigation alone, but through the judicial process. Court proceedings brought the investigation into a formal setting where evidence would be examined under established legal standards. The focus shifted from investigative work to structured evaluation before a jury. Every claim required support, and every exhibit needed explanation grounded in method and record. Prosecutors outlined their position using documented facts. Central to their presentation was the forensic evidence obtained from preserved material. Expert witnesses explained how DNA had been recovered from a cigarette butt collected near where Krystal Beslanowitch had been found. The explanation focused on laboratory procedures, validation steps, and statistical interpretation. Care was taken to describe what the evidence showed and what it did not show. Forensic specialists detailed the evolution of testing methods since the mid-1990s. They explained why earlier examinations had not produced results and how newer techniques allowed recovery from degraded samples. This context was necessary to address questions about delay and reliability. Experts described chain of custody, contamination safeguards, and repeat testing that confirmed findings. Prosecutors also introduced records placing the accused in Utah during the relevant period. Employment information, prior addresses, and other documented records were presented to establish opportunity. These materials were drawn from official sources rather than recollection. The intent was to connect forensic findings with verifiable presence without extending beyond documented facts. Defense strategy centered on challenging the strength and interpretation of the forensic evidence. Attorneys questioned whether the DNA could have been deposited under circumstances unrelated to the death. They scrutinized laboratory methods, sample age, and handling procedures. Expert witnesses for the defense addressed potential limitations and alternative explanations consistent with the evidence. Cross-examination focused on statistical probabilities and laboratory controls. Questions explored margins of error and the possibility of contamination. Forensic staff responded by describing elimination databases, controlled environments, and internal review processes. The exchange highlighted how scientific evidence is evaluated through competing interpretations rather than assertion. Other aspects of the investigation were also examined. Investigators testified about evidence collection, storage, and documentation. They explained how items had been preserved for years and why re-examination was initiated when technology advanced. This testimony aimed to show continuity and diligence rather than certainty. The jury received instructions on how to evaluate forensic evidence. These instructions emphasized that DNA association alone does not explain events. Jurors were directed to consider all admitted material together and to weigh credibility and reliability. The burden of proof remained with the prosecution throughout. Proceedings extended over several days. Each side presented exhibits, expert testimony, and argument within defined limits. Objections were addressed by the court to ensure adherence to evidentiary rules. The atmosphere remained formal and controlled, reflecting the seriousness of the allegations and the complexity of the evidence. Closing arguments summarized positions without introducing new information. Prosecutors reiterated how preserved evidence, when combined with documented presence, supported their position. Defense counsel emphasized uncertainty and limitations, urging careful consideration of scientific margins and alternative explanations. The jury was reminded that decisions must be based solely on evidence presented. After deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Their decision reflected an assessment of forensic findings, corroborating records, and expert testimony. The verdict represented the conclusion of judicial evaluation rather than investigative determination. The trial demonstrated how advances in science intersect with legal standards. Evidence preserved decades earlier had been examined through modern methods and tested in court. The outcome rested not on narrative, but on documented fact, expert explanation, and the application of law. After deliberations concluded, the jury returned with a verdict based on the evidence presented in court. The decision reflected their evaluation of forensic testimony, documentary records, and the standards explained by the judge. The finding established legal responsibility under the charges filed, bringing an end to the trial phase and moving proceedings into sentencing. Following the verdict, the court scheduled a separate hearing to determine punishment. Sentencing required consideration of statutory guidelines rather than emotion or public reaction. The judge reviewed the jury's finding alongside applicable law, prior convictions, and factors allowed under sentencing rules. Written reports and legal arguments informed this process. Prosecutors requested a sentence consistent with the seriousness of the offense and the defendant's criminal history. Their position relied on documented records rather than narrative framing. Defense submissions focused on legal considerations permitted at sentencing, including proportionality and statutory limits. The court considered both sides within defined boundaries. The judge imposed a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. This outcome was based on Utah law and the defendant's prior convictions, which influenced sentencing eligibility. The ruling was delivered formally, with an explanation grounded in statute rather than commentary. Court records reflected the sentence as a legal determination rather than a symbolic conclusion. The sentencing marked a shift from evidentiary examination to enforcement of judgment. Responsibility for the matter moved from courtroom proceedings to the correctional system. Appeals remained a legal option as in any conviction, but the trial court's role had concluded. For investigators and forensic staff, sentencing confirmed that preserved evidence and later scientific analysis had met legal standards. Their involvement transitioned to record maintenance and potential appellate review support if required. The outcome did not alter the importance of documentation, which remained essential for any future legal consideration. Public reporting summarized the verdict and sentence, often noting the length of time between the original investigation and the court's decision. These reports focused on factual milestones rather than interpretation. For the legal system, the emphasis remained on process and adherence to law. The conclusion of sentencing did not change the historical record of what occurred in 1995. It represented accountability determined through judicial review. The preserved evidence, examined years later, had been weighed openly and tested through adversarial process. What followed was not an ending defined by closure, but a legal resolution defined by statute. The court's decision established consequences based on proven facts and lawful procedure, demonstrating how evidence preserved over decades can still be examined and judged within the framework of the justice system. With sentencing complete, the record of events stood defined by documented fact and judicial review. The investigation that began in 1995 concluded through lawful procedure rather than assumption. What remained was an opportunity to examine how evidence, time, and institutional practice interacted across decades. One of the clearest lessons involved preservation. Decisions made at the discovery site and during early investigation ensured that physical material was protected even when immediate analysis failed. Without careful storage, documentation, and custody tracking, later scientific advances would have had nothing to work with. Preservation did not guarantee resolution, but it kept resolution possible. The investigation also illustrated the limits of forensic science within its historical context. Early testing methods could not extract usable information from degraded samples. This limitation was not due to neglect or error, but to the state of technology. Understanding those limits is essential when reviewing older investigations. Outcomes depend not only on effort, but on available tools. Advances in DNA analysis changed what evidence could reveal. These advances required validation, training, and acceptance within courts. Science alone did not produce accountability. Its findings had to be explained, tested, and challenged through legal process. This interaction between laboratory work and courtroom scrutiny defined the path toward resolution. The role of documentation proved equally significant. Written records, photographs, laboratory reports, and custody logs provided continuity when personnel changed and years passed. These records allowed later investigators and forensic staff to understand context without relying on memory. Accurate documentation preserved meaning alongside material. The judicial process demonstrated restraint. Evidence was evaluated within strict rules. Genetic association was treated as one component rather than a complete explanation. Courts required corroboration, verification, and expert interpretation. This approach reduced the risk of overstatement and ensured that conclusions rested on tested proof. The length of time between discovery and sentencing highlighted the reality that accountability does not always follow quickly. Delays can reflect complexity rather than indifference. For families and communities, waiting carries weight, but legal systems prioritize accuracy over speed. This balance can be difficult, yet it protects against error. Community response, reflected through reporting rather than commentary, underscored the impact of unresolved deaths. Public interest returned when legal action occurred, reminding observers that time does not erase responsibility. At the same time, coverage emphasized process rather than spectacle, aligning with the seriousness of the outcome. The investigation demonstrated how patience functions within justice systems. Evidence remained unchanged while science advanced. Investigators revisited material only when methods justified reexamination. Prosecutors acted when standards were met. Courts evaluated claims through adversarial testing. Each role operated within defined limits. The record now shows how accountability can emerge long after an event, shaped by preservation, procedure, and persistence, rather than narrative certainty. The outcome did not rewrite the past. It applied law to verified fact using tools that became available over time. What endures is a reminder that investigations extend beyond initial effort. They depend on institutional memory, scientific progress, and adherence to legal standards. When those elements align, even long unresolved deaths can be examined with clarity, restraint, and respect for truth established through evidence rather than assumption.